So let's talk about this other story. I think we're probably we'll start it here, but I think this conversation may go into the next block because I have an opinion that probably is going to get me kicked off the set. So Joe Biden obviously has a large lead in the poll, but he's defiantly rejecting criticism from his rivals for the Democratic presidential nomination. After remarks at a New York City fundraiser on Tuesday night, Biden invoked working with powerful segregationists early in his career. Channeling a Southern drawl, Biden said, "I was in the caucus with James O. Eastland. He never called me boy. He always called me son. Herman Talmadge was one of the meanest guys I ever knew." Well, guess what? At least there was some civility. We got things done. We didn't agree on much of anything. We got things done. But today you look at the other side and you're the enemy, not the opposition, the enemy. We don't talk to each other anymore. Yesterday, Cory Booker called on Biden to apologize, and he said, "You don't joke about calling black men boys." Vice President Biden's relationship with proud segregationists are not the model to make America a safer and more inclusive place for black people and for everyone. On his way into another fundraiser in Maryland last night, Biden reacted with indignation, and he called on Booker to apologize.
I could not have disagreed with Jim Eastland more. And he was a segregationist. I ran for the United States Senate because I disagreed with the views of the segregationists. There were many of them in the Senate at the time. What I was talking about was the Voting Rights Act. I was able to pass the Voting Rights Act when I was a young senator, when he was still the chairman. We voted against him and beat him in the Voting Rights Act. The point I'm making is you don't have to agree. You don't have to like the people in terms of their views, but you just simply make the case and you beat them. You beat them without changing the system.
How does it feel that your Democratic rivals are implicitly saying that you have issues talking about race?
They know better.
Are you going to apologize like Cory Booker
apologize
has called
for what?
Cory Booker's called for it.
Cory should apologize. He knows better. There's not a racist bone in my body. I've been involved in civil rights my whole career. Period. Period. Period.
And last night, Senator Booker responded this way.
When he says, almost jokingly, remember he was mocking a Southern accent when he said that. They didn't call me boy, they called me son. Well, the reason why they call a young white man son is because these segregationists, these racists could see in him themselves. The reason why they would call black men boys was an attempt to establish the other, to dehumanize, to degrade them. And for him not to understand this and why people would take a deep offense to the way he used and dredged up this awful language. I know that I was raised to speak truth to power, and that I will never apologize for doing that. And Vice President Biden shouldn't need this lesson.
Senator Booker wasn't the only Democratic candidate criticized Joe Biden for his comments. Bernie Sanders shared Booker's statement on social media. I agree with Cory Booker. This is especially true at a time when the Trump administration is trying to divide us with its racist appeal. Senator Elizabeth Warren weighed in, saying, "I'm not here to criticize other Democrats, but I'm going to criticize another Democrat." She said, celebration, you can't celebrate segregationists. Never. I didn't know he did. And here is Senator Kamala Harris and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio.
To coddle the reputations of segregationists, of people who, if they had their way, I would literally not be standing here as a member of the United States Senate, is, I think, it's misinformed and it's wrong.
Does he apologize for that?
He's going to have to make that decision. But, let's be very clear that the senators that he is speaking of with such adoration are individuals who made and built their reputation on segregation.
My wife is African American. We have two beautiful children. James Eastland literally thought my wife and I should not have the legal right to marry, that those children should not exist, that our children should not be on this earth. That's how personal it is for me. I think the bottom line here is, why on earth would a Democrat speak nostalgically of working with a segregationist?
Oh, my Lord. All right, how do we want to do this? How do we want to do this? Should I talk first and then everybody can yell at me?
Sure,
right? Okay. Yeah, pretty much. Let me do it first.
Let's do that.
First of all, Kamala, I love Kamala, but Joe Biden didn't coddle any segregationists in anything that he said. In fact, I think he called one of them one of the meanest people he ever met. If that's coddling, please stay away from me, Joe. Don't hug me. Don't coddle me. That's not coddling. Also, he didn't speak with adoration about these segregationists. His point was, I mean, it wouldn't have been very persuasive, would it, if he said, you know what, I have proven over the past 30 years I can work with Tom Carper and every member of the Delaware delegation. That's not the point. He picked the people who were the most repugnant to him, who he disagreed with the most. And he said, I could even work with him. Now, who was it that says, was it Rumsfeld that says, you fight on the battlefield with the enemy that's presented to you, something like that, right? Well, guess what? FDR. The brilliance of FDR is he could work with Yankees from New England, and he could work with segregationists and racists from the South. And you know what happened when FDR did that? He passed Social Security. He passed the New Deal. He saved this country, and he saved poor people like my parents in the Deep South. He also saved black Americans in Chicago. I mean, FDR didn't sit there and go, you know what? I'm not going to deal with the racists in the South. Eleanor and I are going to just sit here and have tea. And we're going to have radio broadcasts where we speak in self-righteous indignation all day. And we may have a crumpet, too. But the point is, I'm not talking to those people because they offend me. It would have been a pretty bad country if that happened. He also had to deal with the same segregationists as we moved towards World War II to defeat Hitler. Sometimes, to get to 60 votes to change America, you have to deal with people whose views you may find repugnant. You can say the same thing about LBJ, who had to deal with people in 64 and 65. He had to drag them over the finish line to pass the Voting Rights Act. He did it in 64 and 65. So, I understand everybody wants to knock Joe Biden, wants to take him down a notch or two, but I'm sorry, as a Southern Baptist, this is like people in the Southern Baptist Conference. A lot of us got really upset when Billy Graham went to the Soviet Union back in the 1980s. Why would he do that? And Billy Graham said, because I think communists need Jesus too. All right, well, Joe Biden wasn't converting, but he wasn't just sitting there preaching to the choir. He was getting the votes he needed to pass the Civil Rights Act. Let's start with you.
Yeah.
Okay, you're about to jump
yeah,
over the table.
no, I think we can have a really good debate here as the fellow Southern Baptists grew up in the South.
Right.
We're talking about an era when Jim Crow was still law of the land.
Right.
We're talking about language working with people before they had worked out the Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. So I think that to go back to that kind of language in this era when he should be more politically savvy if he wants to win in this climate of the Democratic Party.
What language are you talking about?
The boy, saying the word boy. Growing up in the Deep South, I've been around older white men and have heard them use that kind of language with black men.
Are we talking about that part of the interview?
It's not funny.
Are we talking about him actually, the larger point, which was he worked with segregationists. He knew how to get things done, even with people he's
the larger point, I think, is fine. It's the casualness, making fun, making light of the behaviors that were accepted during that period that should not have ever been accepted.
Correct.
So I think it was offensive, using segregationists as an example and saying that it was a civil time. When he says those things, it brings back a time for Black Americans at that time who did not see this environment as civil to them. Who, if you think about that body of senators who were mostly white males, they were denying the rights of Black people. And so when you have someone who wants to be the leader of the Democratic Party, who goes back to a time that was incredibly hurtful, and you look at the moment that we are in today, 24 hours prior to we learned about the statement, he said it the same night of Donald Trump's rally, you saw white supremacists marching to Donald Trump's rally. You saw the current president basically encouraging and inviting these kind of very hateful people, right? White supremacy, Nazis. And this is the same kind of behavior that we saw from Donald Trump during Charlottesville. So it is a very kind of sensitive moment for people and hurtful moment. And so when you have Joe Biden saying that, it really does trigger things for people. And one more thing, because this is very layered. One last thing I want to say. In that clip that you showed, and you have Biden standing outside in front of the black SUV, and he's going back. They're going back and forth with him. He's talking about Cory Booker. He's joking about not being called a boy. Then Cory Booker says it is dehumanizing for black men to be called a boy. And then Cory Booker, one of 3 African-American senators, right? He tells Cory Booker that he needs to apologize to him. I think that's the worst part. That is really the worst part of that piece that I saw, and it just shows that he is out of step. And I've said this on many shows and on your show, Joe. Is I love Joe Biden. I got to work very closely with him. I got to know him. I do not think he is a racist, but it is problematic. And I don't think anybody's saying that, but it is problematic.
Did Cory Booker suggest that he was either a racist or racially insensitive?
I think he's racially insensitive. Probably. I think Cory Booker can speak for himself, but it is problematic that he brought that up as an example.
Remember Trent Lott? Remember how he got pushed out?
But there's such a huge difference. Trent Lott had said, as you well remember, Trent Lott had said the nation would have been much better if Strom had been elected in '48. Again, Steve, what Joe Biden was saying is, I couldn't even work with the deplorables. I can even work with those segregationists because they had no choice at the time but to do that. And I didn't scream and yell. We figured out a way to work together, even though we disagreed with each other. Just like, you can go all the way back to the beginning, just like Alexander Hamilton dealt with a lot of Virginia slave owners at the beginning of the Republic. And yes, how deeply, deeply, horrifically offensive that was.
Look, I was going to add to your list that if it weren't for LBJ dealing with some of those people, we wouldn't have Medicare, we wouldn't have Medicaid, we wouldn't have the Great Society, because that was part of what he did. But look, I was actually at that event where Biden spoke, and let me put in a little bit of context. First of all, this was a piece of, and I'm not disagreeing or taking offense with what you said, this was a piece of a long Biden, wandering of the landscape. Secondly, this was in the context of something that is a bit of a debate in the Democratic process at the moment, which is, do you do better by trying to work with the other side, or do you do better by trying to get a supermajority or a large group of progressives together and ram stuff through on a one-party vote? And he was staking out ground, which is not where everybody else is, that you want to work together, and that the way to get stuff done is to work together. This bit that has gotten all the attention was 1/10 of the time we've spent talking about it so far. It was a paragraph, maybe a sentence, in this broader construct that he was trying to create about working with other people. Look, do I think he could have picked 2 better examples of people that he worked with? Sure, I guess he could have.
But I have to say, as a lawyer, I would say no. He couldn't pick 2 better examples. Those are the examples you would pick because they were the people that you found to be most deplorable. And yes, I could even work with them even though their views were deplorable. We figured out a way to work together, get 60 votes. I figured out a way to pass a Civil Rights Act, figured out a way to do a lot of things that helped a lot of Americans. And one other thing, too, really quickly, and then I'll get back to you brought up Charlottesville. I think it's very telling that Joe Biden, Jim VandeHei, and then we'll wrap this up on this, but we're going to keep talking. We may be talking about this for 3 hours. We'll talk about this on the other side of the break. But Jim VandeHei, it's important to remember that when Joe Biden launched his campaign, what did he launch it talking about? Charlottesville. Right. He said he was running and knew that he was going to run after he saw the racism in Donald Trump's approach to Charlottesville.
What's interesting, you talk to people around Biden, they're less concerned about sort of the lasting effect of whether or not people are accusing him of racism because they think that that's nonsense. What concerns them is that he's talking about something that happened so far in the past, that he looks like a man out of touch with the times.
Right.
And one of the things they've been working with him a lot on is like, look forward, look forward. Everyone wants to make it seem like you've been in politics for 30, 40 years like you have, and that the Democratic Party has moved beyond you. And so there's a lot of talk at how he's going to handle this upcoming debate. How can he start to move forward, not make all these references, regardless of who the characters are. Stop making references about people 10, 20, 30 years ago, because you've got Elizabeth Warren, Buttigieg, and others who are making the case about what the new America looks like and what the new Democratic Party should look like. And if it ends up being him against somebody who has a vision that feels more of the moment and more of something that will shape Democrats for the future, that's what scares them. And so that's what's going through Biden's mind when you see how he's talking about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You really should talk less about his lazy weekends with Henry Clay. Talk more about how in 2011, and he could do this, how he worked with groups and actually pushed Barack Obama in a way that really made Barack Obama very angry, pushed Obama and the Obama administration towards marriage equality. And that was Joe Biden. The Obamas didn't want to talk about that.
But he also talked about that the other night. He talked about how he was the compromiser who got some of these budget deals done, I think, in the 2013 period. This is a paragraph that obviously got a lot of attention for a reason, but he is not completely mired in the 18th century.
No offense, Steve, but the fundamental disconnect of you being there at the fundraiser while Joe Biden has this slip up and he's not out talking to people, he's not out dealing with the press is the underlying huge problem.
What do you mean?
Because he's dealing with big donors.
Everybody does.
Yeah.
He's made that conscious choice, and he isn't being open with the press. He isn't. He's going around, and the next appearance was at another fundraiser.
Well,
and he's not going to be able to survive in this environment where he's making so many gaffes like that when he is being loose-lipped.
There was a pool there. It wasn't like these remarks were leaked out by somebody who's there. The pool was there, so it was in effect open press.
I think what you're trying to say is that he's been getting hit for not going out there and doing town halls, and instead he's doing. I think that's what you're trying to say. Instead of doing donors meetings.
Yeah, he has not done nearly as many public events as some of his rivals, and I do think, to Steve's point, it sort of crystallizes that idea of what do Democrats want right now in this primary. Is the message you're trying to say, do we want to work together or do we want to fight? He seems a little out of step with that the argument for compromise, and again, calling for Senator Booker to apologize. I think that in particular is what has sort of galled a lot of people in the last 24 hours.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Maxine Waters basically called every Republican a racist, and I was deeply offended by it, went up and confronted her, and we've been friends since. Hey, Maxine, how you doing? Well, we'll keep talking about this on the other side. Love to hear what David Ignatius says. This reminds me of that Washington Post script, a Washington Post column I wrote, I think, last week, where he talked about people were mocking Donald Trump for sticking to script and only sticking to script at Normandy. I said, that ain't nothing. Like Joe Biden would do well the rest of the campaign to stick to script. He didn't. He got in trouble. Joe, stick to script. We'll be right back. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.